Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Get Smartr, an LZ podcast. Today, we've got an episode that is hot off the press. I've got two subject matter experts here that we're going to talk about the ISO 55000 series. They've been revised. The first was published 10 years ago. It's taken a long time to make sure that these standards are covering our industries where they're going, where they're supposed to be, and big time into the future. So we're going to talk about the revisions of the standard, the differences from the first edition, some benefits and pitfalls that we see is coming as organizations try to adopt these revisions of the standards. And we're going to provide some specific insight into the standards expansion into areas of competency and data management. So I've got two subject matter experts with me here today. I have Charlotte Anderson, who is a senior instructional designer and change management expert at Lifecycle Engineering. Charlotte, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I have Brian Kaiser. Brian Kaiser is an ISO 55000 subject matter expert. So I am thrilled that he's been able to digest this new standard, and both of these experts are going to be able to explain to you, our listeners out there, what is different about these standards and why they matter to you and your organization. So welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Hello, Tara. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I've got some great questions here for you today. So let's start with the first burning question, which is, what are the key revisions to this new edition of the ISO 55001 standard, and how do they differ from the previous version? I'd like to start off with Brian for this question, more technical side of the changes. Brian, what do you think?
Okay, well, there's a lot of aspects to go through if you've done any reading yourself and or maybe you're already familiar with the standard before and have seen the new 2024 revision. But in my own review, I think you can categorize or group the different changes into five major areas. First off, and I think most importantly, really, is much more explicit and much more guidance around how to manage risk. And then there really isn't kind of the whole concert in aligning with ISO 9001, all the other ISO standards that are constantly being revised. And you see that come through in really a number of different sections in the standard. Secondly, there's an increased emphasis on the leadership involvement and how important it is to get leadership commitment, visible commitment that the organization can see as setting ISO 55000 or setting best practice asset management as the vision forward for the organization.
Yes, part of the strategy.
Definitely. Third, there's more feedback loops in place regarding the impacts of assets and the impacts of the asset management activities on stakeholders, on organizational objectives, on reporting on performance, a whole range of areas there. Fourth, they've clarified, thankfully, because this is a big topic for organizations that are starting their asset management journey, but they've clarified what the strategic asset management plan, or the SAMP, should look like. They've done a lot to clarify how asset management decision-making should be laid out, which was very unclear in the 2020 or 2014.
Very broad, right? So
yeah,
they've taken it down specific.
Yeah, exactly. And in how to address opportunities, which is lumped together in this risks and opportunities language previously, but now is its own section that lays out, what that process should look like as compared to addressing risks. And finally, there's some expanded guidance on the competencies area and how knowledge should be accessible to different layers of the organization depending on their need, and how the asset information, the asset data, and the important documents of the asset management of ISO 55000 standard should be accessible.
That's great. Thank you for breaking down, as you said, a lot of changes into these five categories, and we're going to talk a little bit more, about them as we continue the discussion. But you gave us a great segue on the fifth one, which is the expanded guidance into competence, and that's why Charlotte's here today. Charlotte for lifecycle engineering has actually taken a really deep dive into these new areas of the standard. And so I'd like to ask you, Charlotte, if you would talk a little bit about that, about maybe you have a couple main topics in this new expansion that you could shed some light on for our listeners.
Absolutely. I got drawn to this 55012 section because it's titled Asset Management Guidance for People Involvement and Competence. And I think the important part about that is the obvious link between a successful asset management program and the involvement and skill set of the people executing it. Brian made a few comments that relate directly to this part of the standard, such as visible leadership, the importance of visible leadership, the importance of some skills in as part of a strategic asset management plan that include decision-making capabilities, and even the shared knowledge and accessibility of knowledge about the asset management program or plans and so on. So what I really like about this particular expansion is it's got two main areas that I think are easily overlooked in a technical setting. The first is the importance of involvement of people, and I think we do a pretty good job of including people in most business operations, but inclusion and involvement are two different things. Involvement gives people responsibility and opportunity to participate, and rather than just being on the receiving end of organizational directives. So it's an opportunity to promote individual commitment and contribution, and gives employers the opportunity to really operationalize initiatives behind change management. It's an understanding that realizing that the people involved in executing on their plan really should be educated about change management. And the last part about competence says that you got to make sure that people performing the work are skilled at it. And this is not a question of we've got folks at different levels and so on. It's a matter of knowing what your expectations of knowledge and expertise are and having a way to measure that among the people who are doing it. Leaders, uh, line supervisors, direct level employees, they all should have an understanding of the knowledge, skills, and ability to do their job, the standards you're going to use to measure it, and how that contributes to organizational growth. My first thought about that when I was trying to summarize it is that engagement that comes from that involvement is the way that employees voluntarily allocate their most valuable source, which is discretionary effort. And you want employees to give you their discretionary effort.
Yeah, give you their best.
Right.
I love that inclusion versus involvement, the difference between receiving an email about something or being invited to a workshop to really contribute to an effort going on, and
That's it
engagement from
exactly.
involvement. Right.
Right.
That's great. Thank you both for summarizing some pretty big changes. I want to talk about because Charlotte, the 55,012 is pretty new, right? So it wasn't, there have already been organizations that have been pursuing and have been compliant, with the 2014 version, of the ISO 55,000 standard. And kudos,
Right.
those are forward thinking, resilient, strategic, and sustainable organizations that are doing so.
Right.
So Brian, these changes, how do you think that they will affect businesses already compliant or ones that were already seeking certification prior to these revisions?
Mhm. Sure, Taryn, it's a great question. I'm sure a lot of organizations are thinking about right now. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the 2024 revision of ISO 55001 and the additional guidance that's in 55,012, 55,013 in these additional documents, they're really just an evolution of where the practice of asset management has gone since 2014. They're trying to capture all the different realms of exploration and ways that high performing organizations have implemented asset management. So, in a way, it's really just expanded guidance that's giving you a better idea of what your organization can do and how it can get better in managing its physical assets, rather than a new bar, right?
Right.
Setting an even
No,
higher bar to hit.
absolutely. Yeah. So it's a reassurance, as well,
Mhm.
like get providing organizations with more details that for which they can, mature their own programs too. So that's very reassuring. There was another section as well that was added, and this section I was really excited about because I think it's right in line with what you were talking about, the standard evolving through learnings, through watching high performance organizations, but also understanding, the future or the now, and the perceived future of where asset management should go, and how different data and technology is supporting that, and where data assets fit in. So this is where 55,013 guidance on the management of data assets. And I would, if for our listeners, if you could summarize a little bit about that standard, I think that would be really, or that section, I think that would be really helpful for our listeners.
I hope so. It's a new realm in terms of how specific the guidance has been now in the standard. As before, there were just two sections, 7.5 and 7.6, that rolled together all the documentation that was required, as well as all the operational data and all of the historical information, work order history and everything. And it made a lot of broad statements about how to manage those, but didn't get into very specifics. And I think that's, we're talking about the evolution over the last 10 years. I think it's become even more apparent of two things. One is that the information that an organization has about its assets is critically important to making good decisions about how to manage them, but, starting today and thinking long into the future. And secondly, is that there was a lot of confusion around what an asset management system is. And we've seen this at a number of just different organizations, that maybe when they start their journey and think asset management, maybe whether it's from the amount of vendor presentations you see out there, or
Sure.
it's
They're
from
thinking
conferences, that
CMMS
it's
or,
always, what's your new,
MES or, yeah.
what's your new EAM system going to be? All right.
Yeah.
Are you in the IBM camp or the SAP camp, or or are you one of those crazy third parties?
It's a bunch of vendor brands. Yeah. Instead
Yeah.
of what the concept, what the strategy is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what I see behind the new 55,013 standard is more laying at some clear lines between what we mean by asset management system being the people and processes, and that then there needs to be a underlying system, a supporting system that manages the data about the physical assets and helps and really enables, that decision making. But then it all comes back to the people and the processes, which is the real core of the standard.
I love that. I know we've often said, people, process, then technology, or data, data management. So get those foundations right. I hope you don't mind, but I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier. Brian, this is for you. But you were talking about there was a difference between, or not a difference, but there were both risks and opportunities with regards to your asset management. Could you give me an example of like an opportunity? What would that look like? I've been so used to the standard focusing on defining risks, and sometimes risks can be, I guess, positive. So I'm not really sure if, could you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. And it's understandable, because I think business risk is talked about in a lot of contexts, right? And that is inevitably going to be the primary driver behind an effort like this and putting so much effort into managing assets. It's going to be, well, how am I going to manage my risks? How am I going to prevent the bad things from happening, whether they've happened in the past and everyone feels burned, or that they're just worried about them happening in the future. And so the opportunities a lot of time come secondary to that, understandably. But to give you an example of that, I mean, an asset opportunity as opposed to a risk may be, seeing a new business opportunity, right? Realizing additional capacity out of a production line through increased reliability. Well, now that has created, in that case, a business opportunity, right? But you may be able to capitalize on that and do some expansion or bring in new customers, new clients, what have you. Another example of an opportunity can come from an understood risk, right? So if you have recognized the risk of a particular type of asset failing, right, and you develop a strategy to mitigate that risk. Well, if you've only done that in one relatively confined scenario, say one model of pump or one application of an asset, there may be other engineering opportunities that opens up, though, where you now realize that there's a similar risk that exists in other places, but you're also realizing an opportunity and addressing that risk proactively, rather than waiting for that failure to happen and to bite you.
Thank you. Those are some really good examples and put it into perspective for me. I especially like the first one where the opportunity comes because you've done the work, because you're able to harness the benefits of reliable operations to open up a capital project, do an expansion or explore other business opportunities. That's really inspiring. Charlotte, do you have anything to add?
I do. I was thinking about the way Brian presented that information, and it really got me thinking about how one of the great values of the standards are that it's practical guidance for users wherever they are at their current level. And that success is a result of building. It's not starting out with the expectation that we're doing everything the best way possible, but we're given some foundation of how things should be done so that you can have the most success. So I'm thinking about the involvement of employees and prospective supervisors and so on. You don't have to have all the great programs at the very beginning, but start with some involvement opportunities when you're thinking about asset management or expansion. Think about ways you can incorporate education or cultivating knowledge or even harvesting knowledge from some of your more senior workers as you proceed through some of the incremental steps that Brian was talking about. All of those things really align nicely with the 55,012 standard.
Well said. Well said. And I think, actually, I think the ISO organization would be very pleased with how we were able to synergize all of that. So, so kind of continuing along that thread, I want to talk a little bit about the timing, of the publication of these new standards. I mean, it's been underway since, I guess, the first one was launched. There's constant continuous improvement happening in the ISO standard. But I also think that there's a lot of current industry trends and emerging technologies that people are buzzing about. And I want to ask you both, what do you think about the timing of the publication, and how do you feel that it might be reflecting our current industry temperature, or some of the new technologies in Industry 4.0 and digitalization and, all of those AI, all the buzzwords that are out there, as well as the industry trends of the skills gap, exiting workforce, new workforce, those couple trends specifically. How do you think these revisions and expansions reflect that? And Charlotte, I'm going to go to you first on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I get excited about the inclusion of human performance in a lot of the technical aspects we see in our industry. Brian mentioned earlier that there was the link between people and processes, and how that really makes a difference in your whole success of the asset management plan. So I think looking forward, as organizations are going to be facing different labor markets, they're going to be facing different access to different knowledge bases, including whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the digitalization of the workplace. We're going to need people who are competent in those skills and interested in them. And I think organizations that are future focused are thinking about that now and saying, okay, this is what we want to do technically with our business or our production or our operations, or this is how we're going to do things more efficiently. But what does that mean for the people who are actually going to execute on these things? And it's going to give them a diverse workforce to choose from. It might change the concentration of the kind of workers they're looking for. So I think all of their operations are going to be affected, from human resources, compensation programs, remote workers, how we're going to educate folks, how we're going to search for folks. I think it's really exciting.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And Brian, from your perspective, what do you think about the expansions and revisions and how they reflect what's currently happening in our industry?
Well, first off, I wanted to add that I totally agree with Charlotte's view on the fact that an asset management transformation, or the pursuit of of establishing an asset management system, involves all the parts of an organization, and realizing that up front and planning for it, and how this new standard can help you in that is already going to put you ahead of a lot of organizations.
I think what might be our last question for our podcast today, but I'm kind of sad because we've had so much fun talking about this. And listeners, if you have specific questions about the standard, please reach out to us. I'll tell you how at the end of this episode. But I would love to bring back Charlotte and Brian for some take twos of what's going on new with the asset management. So that is a great segue, Brian, into my last few questions of the podcast today. First, I want to ask, since the standard is a great way, to get you on your feet and to help guide you through all the parts of building an asset management system, building that strategy for the future, what steps can an organization take to either, if they're already on the path, towards certification, or if they're aware of, the standard and just kind of want to see how they measure up, what are some things that organizations can do to continue to pursue, or maybe even adjust their strategy to align better with this new guidance?
Well, I'd say first off, I think educating yourself and the people of your organization about the standard in general, and about the changes of the 2024 revision is a great first step. And hopefully this what we're able to convey today is a good step in that direction. I think secondly, it involves adjusting maybe some expectations, or adjusting whatever your personal or your organization's roadmap towards best practice asset management might look like. And so the best way to start that is to first understand where you are today, right? Yeah, every organization is different, and every organization's history of asset management is a bit different. So understanding how the language of ISO 55000 2024, how your organization stacks up against that is going to help you set a good, achievable roadmap that takes you to where you want to be in the long term.
Great. And Charlotte, anything to add?
I would just say, whether you have already started your 55,000 journey or just considering it, now is the time to just be sure that all of your decision makers and individuals in positions of authority to make some of those decisions really understand the human element of the success of the implementation. That nothing is going to happen without the involvement of dedicated, engaged, competent, aligned people. So get that in order, and the rest of the process will have fewer obstacles.
That's fantastic. That's also speaks back to what Brian was talking about at the opening about active, visible leadership involvement and commitment and understanding of. And now that the people side of the standard used to kind of reside under the leadership and strategy in the earlier version, but now it's also got an expansion specific to people involvement, which I think is and we've heard from y'all is so key and helpful to people starting pursuit of ISO 55000 excellence, asset management excellence. So you heard it here, folks. If you're not familiar with the standard, and I know some of our listeners may not be, you should be. And we have resources out there to help you, because it will help your organization achieve that organizational alignment, achieve that asset management excellence, be resilient and ready for the future. Actually, I do want to say one other thing. Brian, do you have another resource, outside of LCE that you would send someone who doesn't know anything about the standard to, other than, going down and purchasing it yourself? But there might be another resource that you would provide for people just to get more familiar with asset management and that standard?
Sure. How everyone learns is different. So I think there's a wealth of resources provided by ISO, provided by LCE, and other organizations you'll find out there. But to me, the best way to learn is to see examples. And I think you learn that best through professional organizations like SMRP, like the IAM, and other maintenance and reliability focused organizations. So you can and the network opportunities, the education opportunities that those offer, give you real experience and what other organizations were able to do in their and with their history and their physical assets and their market sector and all those. You have to take into account, but I think you can learn a lot and pick up a lot of good practices that you can apply to your own organization.
And Charlotte, do you have any specific advice you give on folks looking to learn more about competence and people involvement, change management?
I think this is a great opportunity for some partnerships, because there are folks inside your organization who are going to get real excited and who are already very knowledgeable about things like how to promote participation and involvement, how to include people in decisions that affect them, how to measure performance, set performance standards, do assessments, build competence. So this is an opportunity for some of the technical leaders to partner with other folks in their organization to advance their asset management program.
I love that. Bringing the organization together, involvement versus inclusion or over inclusion. So I wanted to go over a few of I thought what were kind of our key points about the revisions and expansions to the ISO standards, and our experts that are here with us today, that these revisions and expansions have come about because of the evolution, because of the learnings that the asset management discipline and asset management strategies and high performance organizations have shown us, and therefore these new standards provide more detailed guidance, especially in the areas of risk, the importance of leadership, involvement and commitment, expansion of feedback loops. What the heck is the SAMP supposed to look like? Thank you, ISO. Competency and people involvement, and data management of data assets. We also talked about that the asset management system is not an EAM. It is the people, the processes, and then the technologies as a support system. It involves all parts of an organization. We talked about the difference between inclusion and involvement, and that the expansion of the standards helps us understand more about the importance of performance expectations and assessing that. And the engagement from involvement that you can get from the people is what's going to propel your organization forward. I also loved what Charlotte said about the success as a result of building, of looking at how things, should be done to get better. Just for our listeners out there, LCE asset management, our asset management experts and individuals like Brian Kaiser and Charlotte here have been involved in the standard creation, but we also know how to help clients achieve the asset management excellence and even ISO certification. So that's what we do: reliability and asset management consulting, training, and ISO assessment and coaching services. So in addition to the resources that we provide in the session notes, if you listeners have any questions that you want us to talk about in a future episode, reach out to us. If you have questions about this standard and how it can impact in your organization, reach out to us. You'll be able to find Brian and Charlotte on LinkedIn as well. They both have profiles out there, so feel free to connect with them, and we'll put their profiles in our session notes. So Charlotte, Brian, I can't tell you how great this conversation has been. I feel like I know the standard a lot better now, even though I read it, the revisions, you brought it so much more to life, and how this standard can help our listeners out there if they're ready to get on that journey. So thank you again so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me today too. So we'll see you next time, listeners, on Get Smartr podcast. Until then, let's stay smarter, people.